try the audio. Can you hear me okay? And can you see me okay? Okay, that's great. And I can see your comments in the chat room. During the session, if you do make a point or ask a question, and if I don't notice it, my apologies, but I'll try to address it at the end of the session if I miss it. It looks like we have people from all over the world. We've got several from South America, and we've got some from North America, all over Europe. We have several from Romania, Ukraine, Russia, over to Vietnam and Japan, and I think from Australia. So we've covered the world. So for such an international audience and or group, it's good we have a very global topic. So today is global competence. And I think before we get into the global competence, and as a few more people are joining, I thought it would be good to start with a quick global quiz with our global group here. So with National Geographic Learning, we aim to bring the world to the classroom. And one of the ways that we do that is through the photography, including the photos we use for the covers of our books. So I'll show you a few photos we've used for the covers, and your challenge is to identify the city or the country, if you want to guess the country. So in the chat room, add in your guess for which city the photo shows. Okay, so first one is here. Oh, it's too easy. Okay, we have a global panel of experts that knew straight away. It's the famous canals of Amsterdam, and we use that photo for World English. It's one of our global 4 skills English courses. How about this one? Yep, I think the yellow cabs give it away. This is actually an aerial photo of a piece of art by an artist called JR, who has a TED Talk, and that is New York City. And that's from our series Perspectives, which is for more teenage and high school students mainly. How about this one? Yeah, I think if anyone's joining from Italy, they have an advantage. It is I think the Galleria Emanuel shopping mall in Milan, Italy. That one also from World English. Oh, it's Luisa's hometown, so you definitely had an advantage there. And there's 2 from the same city. So any guesses for where these are? These are 2 aerial photos of hotels. Marid and Alex, yes, we got some guesses for Singapore, my hometown, where it is now 8 o'clock and quite warm. And these photos were used for 2 courses, 21st Century Communication, which develops presentation skills and communication skills with TED, and Keynote, which is a general English course for young adults and adults. So the common thread of those course books is that they all use TED Talks as part of the learning materials. And the examples I'll use in this session are all from this range of courses. So TED, I'd like to know first, how much or how familiar are you? So maybe in the chat room, just choose an option that is true for you, A, B, or C. Let me see, so we've got actually quite a lot of A's and several B's and a few C's. So if you're not familiar with TED, TED is an organization that arranges conferences and invites speakers to talk about big ideas, important ideas in technology and education and design and business and general lifestyle. And they're very short talks, about 15 minutes or shorter. And they're very good for learning materials. including for language learning. So we have a relationship with TED, and we use their TED Talks and adapt them for our materials. So I'll show some examples later. But first, let's look at what we're going to cover today. So we'll look at three main things. What is global competence, and how can we define it? Why is it important? Especially, why is it important for language learners? And how can we help our learners become more globally competent? What are some skills we can help develop? So let me ask you, we have about 230 people out there, so I'd like to know, what do you think it means? So I think we've got a poll. So Emily, if you could put the poll on the screen. You can choose more than one option, as many as you like, for what is a globally competent person, or is someone who can do what or knows what. Yep. Okay. It looks like the last one, yeah, can see the world from different perspectives is probably the most popular option here. Also can adjust to different custom and take an interest in global issues and to be curious about the world. And we'll be looking at all of those aspects as we go through the session. Now we could say, well, global competence is getting a lot of attention at the moment. It seems like kind of a new or recent phenomenon, but actually we could say the origins of it go back many years, and even 150 years ago, roughly, is when this book was published. So I've got a copy here. It was, is that right? Yeah, Jules Verne. And Around the World in 80 Days. It's probably one of the most widely translated novels in the world, and you may have read it, or definitely you may have heard of the book yourself. And Jules Verne wrote it about a journey that two travelers made in 1872. It's a fictional story, but based on real ideas at that time. They went from London through Europe, down through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, and across India, from Asia, across to North America, and then back to London. And the bet was, can they do it in 80 days? And the travelers were Phileas Fogg, who was an Englishman, and his assistant, Passepartout, who was French, but he could speak English as well. And what's interesting in the novel is the different attitudes that these two travelers had as they were traveling around the world in 80 days. And we can see which of these travelers do you think was the more globally competent. Phileas Fogg he says, seldom having the curiosity to even go up on the deck of his boat, passed through the memorable scenes of the Red Sea with cold indifference. He did not care to recognize the historic towns and villages and so on. So really, Fogg was really just concerned in the travel, getting to the next boat, to the next hotel, to the next town, so that he could get around in 80 days. Whereas Passepartout, his assistant, he walked around the mixed population of the cities that he went to. He thought they were very curious, he said. I see it is no means useless to travel if a man wants to see something new. So it's quite a contrast in how they approached their travel. And it's interesting that, I mean, this book has been adapted many times. As Louisa says, there's a film, and there were actually two films, at least. The first in the 50s, Passepartout was played by a Mexican actor, Cantinflas, and it's also been played by a German, Englishman, Australian, Canadian, and most recently by Jackie Chan, who's from Hong Kong, China. So Passepartout was kind of like the original global citizen. He can mix in with any culture or place. So what is it about him that makes him a global citizen? Well, he's curious about the world. He was able to interact with people from different cultures. He could speak more than one language. He could speak French, English, and others. He was very open-minded, and he could think creatively about the problems they encountered and come up with ideas. Perhaps an early example of global competence. Then, of course, 150 years ago, it was very rare to be able to travel around the world like that, quite difficult. Now it's much easier. And global competence today is not rare. It's not just useful, it's a necessity for students today. And this is a quote from the director of the International Education Policy in Harvard University. And Harvard worked with the OECD recently, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, on the PISA program. And I think many of you are probably familiar with PISA. It's a global assessment, a benchmark of education standards around the world. It's taken every 3 years. About 500,000 students in more than 50 countries. And until recently, it focused just on 3 things, on math, science, and reading. But now, last year, was the first time it's introduced global competence as a core element of this educational assessment. So it's been a lot of interest and attention in what that really means and how can we develop it. And so why is it suddenly becoming so important and perhaps a necessity for students? Well, let's look at what kind of world is it that these students are going into? What is planet Earth like? Well, in one of our course books, Pathways, we look at one day on planet Earth. And here are some things that happen or will happen today in the world. The world's population will grow about 200,000 people. More than 8 million people will travel by plane. I don't know, maybe some of you will be traveling by plane today. About 200,000 people will make a big life-changing event by moving from the country into the city, which offers new opportunities and also new challenges as well. And about 4 billion people will use their cell phone to communicate in some way, either by phone or by social media. So the world is a lot more interconnected, of course, than it has ever been before. And this has implications for the students and the skills that they need. This is a quote from a report by the OECD and the Asia Society. They say globalization, the digital revolutions, the technology changes, mass migration, and environmental changes, especially climate, are triggering new concerns and demanding a new kind of graduate. So what kind of skills do students need if they're going into the workplace? Okay, so what do you think? There was a survey that was done by the Institute for the Future, and they asked what skills are going to be the most important for students going into the workplace in 2020. So they surveyed many companies and businesses. So what do you think? Any ideas you have, add them to the chat box. And it could be general skills or more specific skills. So we got, yes, creativity, critical thinking, communication skills, cognitive skills, open-mindedness, yep, intercultural competence, problem solving, yeah. Digital literacy, yep, and I think some of it, information literacy, which are linked, media literacy as well. Digital literacy. Yeah, an adjustment, I think, yeah. So perhaps kind of adjusting to different situations or cultures. Scientific literacy. So let's see what the top 5 were from this survey. Many of you mentioned critical thinking. I think there's been much attention on critical thinking in the last 10 years, especially in education. Number 2, emotional intelligence. And I think that some people mentioned about being able to adjust and deal with people. So a lot of people skills, and that involves dealing with different types of people from different backgrounds. Creative skills, many people you mentioned, and includes problem solving, I think. And this one's interesting. I mean, this is maybe 10 years ago, this cross-cultural competency would not be one of the top 5 most important skills, but it is now rated as very important, perhaps even more important than information literacy and data literacy. It's a cross-cultural competency. And educational systems, frameworks are changing to meet this need for different types of skills. This is probably the most famous framework, the P21 framework. You may be familiar with the 4 C's, which many of you mentioned, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, creativity. So those have had a lot of attention. But the P21 also lists what we call 21st century themes. And first of those is global awareness. So learning from working collaboratively with people from different cultures, and also using those 21st century skills like critical thinking to understand and address global issues. And there's more information on this on the p21.org website if you're interested. So how do we help our learners develop this? How do we get them to become more globally competent? Well, let's look at 4 ways, and these 4 ways will link to 4 aspects of global competence in the OECD framework, which is here, and then you can find more information at there, oecd.org. And the OECD breaks global competence into 4 areas, and the first is investigating the world, examining the world, also being able to appreciate different perspectives, being able to communicate ideas, and finally to be able to take action. So let's look at each of those 4 and how, as educators, how can we help our learners? So let's look at the first one. Examine local, global, and intercultural issues. So this is what globally competent students will need to be able to do. Ask questions, analyze data and arguments, and develop a position or a viewpoint about an issue, about a local or global issue. So what kind of issues are today's young people most concerned about? Again, there was a different survey. This one was by the World Economic Forum, and they asked thousands of people between 18 and 30, what are the global issues you are most concerned about? So let's see which one you think was number 1. So perhaps Emily, if you can pass the what issue is most concerned poll. So have a guess which one of these was the number 1 issue for young people, and by young people between 18 and 30. We've definitely got 2 front runners, although number 3 has overtaken number 1. Yeah, Okay, it's very interesting. Yeah, so definitely the climate change and income inequality, you feel are the ones that are the most important. Okay, yeah, thanks very much, Em. So obviously it depends on the country, and it varies, from region to region, but globally, this was the result. And so climate change, destruction of nature, almost 50% of the people surveyed said that was an issue of, great concern to them, a serious issue. So clearly, young people are very concerned about global environmental issues. So one of the aims with our courses that we develop with National Geographic is to help learners understand those issues and really understand the kind of what's at stake, what are the different sides, and what are the details of the issue, and to inspire them to care about the planet. And also, it's why we work with TED as well. TED has many TED Talks that are good for addressing global issues and especially for environmental issues that, of course, young people are concerned about their future. And one of a good example of this is a talk by a speaker named Robert Swan. Well, I'll let him do the introduction. We have a short clip from the start of his talk, and I'll just show you, it's about a minute. If the sound or the video does not work properly, don't worry, just hold on and I'll review it after it finishes in about a minute.
Let's go south. Let's go south. All of you are actually going south. This is the direction of south, this way. And if you go 8,000 kilometers out of the back of this room, you will come to as far south as you can go anywhere on Earth, the pole itself. Now, I am not an explorer. I'm not an environmentalist. I'm actually just a survivor. And these photographs that I'm showing you here are dangerous. They are the ice melt of the South and North Poles. And ladies and gentlemen, we need to listen to what these places are telling us. And if we don't, we will end up with our own survival situation here on planet Earth.
Okay, so that's Robert Swan giving a talk in Rio at the TED Global Conference a few years ago. I mean, he's quite a good example of a TED speaker who does speak very clearly, and we've used him in one of our courses called Keynote, with low-level students. He uses a lot of visuals, and he makes the case for concern about this issue very clear. But of course, students may think, well, of course, it's a big issue, but what can I do about it? The things that I do may not really have much impact. So we also look at ways to connect these bigger issues to a more local level and to connect with individuals' life. And so one of the ways is looking at choices that we make in our lives and what we buy, what we make, including food. So let me ask you a quick question. So which country do you think has the world's highest meat consumption per person, so not total? And okay, these are the top 5. Which one do you think is the number 1 out of these 5? Okay, great. It looks like China has just tipped Argentina in the last few seconds. And let's have a look at what the top five actually is. And this, remember, this is per person in terms of the meat consumption. So Argentina is actually the number one meat eater. And China, this graph actually shows two things. It's showing the per person total, of which Argentina is the top, but the colors represent how fast the consumption has been increasing over the last few decades. And there you can see China especially has been rising very fast. So probably in the future, China probably will be the number one. And I thought that Alfonso said, I thought the US, yeah, the US it's not there. Canada is. So what's the connection? Well, I mean, there are arguments for meat as one of the main contributors to global warming through the effect on livestock and its effect on rainforest deforestation. So what does that mean? Does that mean we should all eat less meat? I mean, I eat meat, although I'm trying to eat less, but what should we do? Well, maybe we don't need to cut out meat. Here's what you might think is a hamburger. It looks like a hamburger. It apparently tastes like a hamburger, and this was created recently and served in a restaurant in London, but it's actually been grown in a laboratory. So it's a lab-grown burger. And this topic of lab-grown food features in a TED talk by Andras Forgas, who is from Hungary originally, I think. And this is a great TED talk to use in class because it really raises some interesting questions of what is the future of our food, and if maybe we don't need to cut out meat if we can create it without killing animals. And we feature this one in Keynote, our series. And we look at different viewpoints on it. So we're trying to get students to think about the pros, the cons. Would they eat lab-grown meat? Is it a solution? If a factory wanted to be started in your neighborhood, what might be the pros and cons of that? So we're looking at a global issue, but trying to make it local and individual as well. So students feel that they have some connection and that their choices do matter. And I think that's how we approach any global issue really in our courses. First, we select the issue that has some local relevance. We adapt that content so that it is accessible for the language level and it's as relevant as possible. Then we connect the issue with learners' lives. Right? How might their own decisions and their own choices affect it? And then look at it from different perspectives, different viewpoints to develop critical thinking. And that brings us to really the second aspect of global competence in this framework. So the first is examining the issue. What is at stake? What is happening? What is the problem? But also be able to understand and appreciate different perspectives and different viewpoints, different views of the world. According to the OECD report, it says global competent students can show a willingness and capacity to consider global viewpoints, global problems from multiple viewpoints. Or as the OECD director says, to look at the world through different lenses and perspectives. I'll show you a view of the world, and maybe in the chat box, just write whatever you notice. Are there anything unusual or surprising? Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it looks like the world. Actually, when I grew up in Britain, and all the maps in England as I was growing up always had England in the middle and the other countries around it. But I think that's this is a different perspective here. But the main difference, as you say, upside down. Okay, so the text looks like it's upside down, but maybe the text and the labels are correct, and it's actually our view of the world is upside down. So, and when we look at the world like this, it does seem very different to the normal view. Suddenly, Australia is like the center of the world, or at least at the top. The Pacific suddenly seems a bit bigger. There are some places, I mean, Britain is almost off the map there on the right. It's kind of an interesting way of seeing, and the Earth afterwards is just a ball floating in space. There's no top or bottom or up or down really. So this is maybe just as good of a perspective of the world. And this map is used in a TED talk by a speaker named Derek Sivers, and this is another great TED talk to use in class. It's a very short talk, and he looks at how our own assumptions may be different to other people in other parts of the world. And another example he gives is how we give directions. For example, in say in the US, in New York City, you might say, well, it's Main and Second, or like it's Main Street or Second Avenue, or it's about the streets, the street intersections. Whereas if you go to Tokyo, many of the streets don't have street names, and you give directions by the block number or the building number, and the streets are really just the spaces in between the blocks. So what we might assume may be different to other people. Again, this is a great talk. We feature this in our course, World English. It's also, there's a quote from Derek Sivers where he says, sometimes we need to go to the opposite side of the world to realize assumptions we didn't know we had, and the opposite may also be true. This talk is featured in the pre-intermediate level of Learn English with TED Talks, which is an app that we've developed with TED for language learners, English language learners. This is from pre-intermediate level, but there are actually 4 levels going all the way up to upper intermediate. So there's about 40 talks with supporting activities and scripts and instructor materials you can use. If you're interested, at the end, Emily can share a link where you can get a free sample of the TED Talk app. And yeah, as Alexandra mentions, yeah, How to Start a Movement is another one of Derek Sivers' TED Talks, which is a really good one to try. So I think in the survey at the beginning, where we found out how familiar you are with TED, many people mentioned that you've used them in the class. So I'd like to ask you, maybe in the chat box, if you can type either the speaker or the talk name of any talks that you have found work well in your classroom, especially for low-level learners, because there may be other people on the webinar that would be interested to know which ones that you've used. Yeah, a couple of people mentioned Ken Robinson's talk about creativity, I think, in schools, which is the #1 most viewed TED talk of all time, I think. It's a really good one for education. The one about the virtual choir, yeah, Amy Cuddy. I don't know the superhero trash carts. I'll have to check that one out. The virtual choir. Aziz Abu Sarah, yeah, who's one of our National Geographic explorers, who does a great talk about well, about peacemaking in the world. And yes, I mean, several of the ones that you've mentioned, we've also used in some of our coursebook materials, and we've adapted those for language learners, and several are on the TED app as well. So if you've used TED Talks in class, you probably realize they're really good content, great ideas, amazing speakers. You may have had some challenges perhaps with language level, or there may be some parts that were quite challenging for your students. So a question we often get asked is, how do we, National Geographic Learning, how do we select and adapt the TED Talks for our courses? So we really go through three stages. First is selection, and we use several criteria, which you can see here on the screen, to choose our talks. There are hundreds of TED Talks out there on the internet, so we choose the ones that are the most suitable in terms of content, or the topic is approachable and any student might be interested in it. And also what kind of language support is there, visual support, is the speaker's speed reasonable? And also the variety of topics, and also variety of different types of speakers. So for example, this with Keynote, we have a range of speakers from all over the world on different topics. We adapt the talks. Some of them are quite long. I think you may know most TED Talks are about 15 minutes, which may be quite a long time to use in a class in one lesson. So we usually break the talks down into about 5 to 6 minutes, and we add some pauses to help with comprehension. And in some cases, we do reduce the speed slightly, so that for the faster speakers. But most of our work goes into the scaffolding and the language support. So we give a lot of pre-viewing language and vocabulary activities, and previewing, viewing, and post-viewing tasks as well as developing presentation skills. In this talk, for example, we look at Anne Morgan's TED Talk, which is a great one for developing global competence, because she really travels the entire world, and she set up a project where she would read a book from every country in the world, and there's about 190 or so countries, and she created a blog, and she gave a TED Talk about what the experience meant for her and what she learned from it. So really kind of a perfect TED Talk for developing global awareness and global competence. And one of the things she talks about is keeping an open mind for different ways of seeing the world. And that's important, especially today when there's so much information out there on the internet and so many news stories. And it's not always easy to know what's true or not. If you saw this news headline, would you believe it? Giant camel fossil found in the Arctic. Well, it turns out it was actually a true story, and it was a story about a discovery in Alaska, I think, where they found out that a relative of the camel actually once lived in the Arctic area, and many of the adaptations that the camel has, like the hump, make it easier for it to live in cold areas as well. It used to thousands of years ago, although it's died out there. And this is the topic of a TED Talk by Latif Nasser, and this is another one that's really worth checking out. It's called You Have No Idea Where Camels Really Come From. And he gives the talk with this camel. And this one we feature in the course Perspectives. And Latif Nasser says at any moment you could uncover some bit of evidence, some tiny thing that forces you to reframe what you thought you knew. And so in perspectives, we look at, okay, well, when was a time that you discovered something new, or so there was some news story or some information that made you think about the world in a different way. So it comes back to that second aspect of global communication competence, which is understanding different perspectives. So the third part is really about engaging in open, appropriate, and effective interactions. Being able to interact with individuals from different cultures. So let me ask you another question. So what percentage of the world's English users do you think are non-native speakers? And I think we've got one more quiz. So here we go. Okay, so majority feel is 80%, and it's very difficult to, well, it's impossible to know exactly, of course, but roughly, yes, about 80% of the people who can use English to some degree are non-native speakers. In fact, native speakers actually in the top left of this infographic, you can see that area represents the number of native English speakers, which is much smaller than the one for Chinese, and is actually smaller than the one for Spanish. There are more native speakers of Spanish than of English. But when you look at the total number of people that are learning it or can speak it as a second, third language, there's about 1.5 billion. And then when you add on the native speakers, it's getting towards about 2 billion people. So what does this mean? Well, for one thing, it's leading to a whole diverse range of Englishes. English is no longer really just about British English or American English or Australian English. Here in Singapore, we have Singlish, and maybe wherever you live, there may be your own variation of English, which is used effectively for communicating. So it's important to be aware of different types of English. And another implication is that native speakers, well, according to BBC article here, are the world's worst communicators because they tend to talk very fast. They use sort of cultural references, jokes that are difficult to understand across cultures. So now there are actually training courses and learning materials for native speakers to relearn English as a tool for communication. So some people are going back to learn how to use English effectively. And one of the people who has written about this, and she's written some award-winning blogs, is Cha Swan Jong. Her name is there on the right of the screen. And she's written about how English is changing, how non-native speakers are becoming more varied, more proficient, and how native speakers are actually having to learn how to use English for global communication. Because really, it is the English, the world's lingua franca. It is a tool for global communication, and probably most of the interactions using English no longer involve a native speaker. They could be between a East Asian businesswoman doing a deal with a client in the Middle East, or someone from South America using English to travel when they're in Southeast Asia, for example. So English is no longer just about dealing with native speakers or between native speakers. A lot of it is between non-native accents. So there was a survey by The Economist magazine, and they asked businesses around the world, have there been cases of misunderstandings, and have you kind of lost business or lost a deal, and what was the main reason? And they said about a quarter of the companies said that they had had problems caused by language, different languages, but over half of the companies surveyed said there had been problems caused by cultural differences, cultural misunderstandings. So English as a lingua franca is rising and it's becoming more important and useful for communication, but cultural agility is also important, and maybe that combination of cultural agility and English's agility, being able to deal with different types of English and people from different backgrounds, are the kind of keys to global competence and for effective communication. That's one of the reasons why we work with TED, is because they do have so many great English-speaking different people with different accents from around the world who provide great models for learning English. This level of keynote, for example, has people from Brazil, Morocco, Kenya, Hungary, Russia, Vietnam, as well as Britain, America, and Australia. And also, it's important to develop students' own ability to present their own ideas and to consider the audience and consider the people that they are communicating with. What is the cultural or the personal background of their audience? Okay, and that brings us to what the final aspect of this framework for what is global competence is: taking action. So being able to examine global issues is important, understanding different perspectives, being able to communicate ideas about them, but also to eventually take some action. And so what does that mean? Well, it may just be small differences, making a small difference in your life. Could be just related to cooking dishes, teaching a skill, donating things, recycling, sharing stories, volunteering. Because TED's goal is not really to make a single big change. It's, as the head of TED here says, TED's impact is in the millions of small changes that people make. So, I mean, our hope is that with our TED materials and with our National Geographic content, we'll inspire students to maybe make some change or changes in their life that are a positive impact. They do have the power to change. Probably one of the best talks I've seen from TED to inspire students to make changes is this one from Matt Cutts, who says, try something new for 30 days. Often if we say, I'm gonna cut out meat from now on, or I'm gonna do this, it's difficult to maintain it. But if you choose a certain time period, and he recommends 30 days, you go for that, and then if you can manage it for that, then you go and you're able to continue it. And I think some people here on the webinar probably used this talk already in class. This one we feature in 21st Century Reading, and I really recommend this one. And it's also good for getting students to think, well, what could they do as a 30-day challenge? What are they most likely to be able to do? Could they stop eating meat? Could they learn a new skill or learn a new sport? Because it's with those small changes that can together potentially tackle bigger issues. And of course, one of the biggest issues recently is about plastics, and we've probably seen it in the news, in the media, concerns over plastic pollution, especially in the oceans. Now, one of the TED Talks that deals with this is not by an expert in conservation or environment. It's by two teenage students from the Green School in Bali, in Indonesia. And some of you may have seen it already. I'll just show you a brief clip from the end of their talk.
The way we have learned that kids can do things. We can make things happen. Isabel and I were only 10 and 12 years old when we started this. We never had a business plan, nor a fixed strategy, nor any hidden agendas. Just the idea in front of us and a group of friends working with us. All we wanted to do was stop those plastic bags from wrapping and suffocating our beautiful home. Kids have a boundless energy and a motivation to be the change the world needs.
So to all the kids of this beautiful but challenging world, go for it. Make that difference. We're not telling you it's going to be easy. We're telling you it's going to be worth it. Us kids may only be 25% of the world's population, but we are 100% of the future.
We still have a lot of work to do, but know that we will not stop until the first question asked when arriving at the Bali airports will be, "Welcome to Bali. Do you have any plastic bags to declare?"
Om Shanti 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 Om.
Thank you.
It's really incredible what they achieved, and their talk we feature in our course Perspectives, where we have adapted the talk with some previewing activities and vocabulary activities so the students can understand the details of what the talk is about, and hopefully be inspired by this talk as well, and perhaps start thinking about, well, maybe there are some changes I can make in my own life or my own community, where I shop, the things I buy, how products are packaged. And there was a quote from Melati Reason, who's one of the students here. They said, "It all comes down to finding that one thing you're really passionate about, and whatever it is, find out your strongest skills and really go for it." She also said that lesson number one for them was about teamwork. No matter how good your idea is, you will always need a like-minded group to bring your ideas forward into the next phase. And remember, change starts with you. And after they started their program, it didn't just reach throughout Bali. And in fact, Bali has now become an island that is kind of cutting out single-use plastics. It's inspired other people around the world to do similar projects, and they're working with people all around the world, and it grows bigger and bigger each year. Really an incredible story. A few months ago, I was in China. I passed through Shenzhen Airport, which is enormous, and there were some ads from different companies. And I saw this one from a media ad in China, and it was a quote from Jules Verne saying, "Anything you can imagine, other people can make real." I think that's really an important point that Melati Reason was making. Having that idea is great, but you need to be able to communicate it and share it and inspire others to be able to follow on. And that's really what global competence is about. At the beginning, we looked at this example of passe-partout. Actually, passe-partout in French means pass through anything or to go anywhere. And it's also used in English. There's a couple of meanings, quite rare word. It can mean something that allows passage anywhere. And a master key. It's one, like a key that maybe a security guard has that can open any door in a building. I think it's also quite a good definition of global competence, because it's to be able to be globally competent will help you gain passage to anywhere in the world. It will also be a master key that can open, hopefully, more doors for you in life in the future for these students. So just to recap, global competence. What does it mean? Well, to be globally competent, Here are some good things to develop: curiosity, ability to interact, to communicate, open-mindedness, creative thinking, and a kind of a willingness to take action and maybe make a difference. It could just be a small difference, but it may have a big impact. So here are the 4 areas we've looked at: investigating the world, appreciating perspectives, communicating ideas, and finally, taking action for what will be hopefully a safer, healthier, and more sustainable planet. I thank you all for your contributions to the chat room as we're going through. If you do have any questions, please do raise them. While you're thinking of that, I'll pass back to Emily, who has a few words to say about the materials we've looked at and the TED app.
All right. Thank you so much, Sean, and thanks for this great webinar. This was the second one. We had one about 12 hours ago, so thanks for that. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you really took away some practical ideas to help make your students more globally competent. As we wrap up now, I just want to mention, as you've heard, several of the examples used today were from National Geographic Learning programs with TED Talks, which give learners a voice to communicate in English and to share the ideas that are important to them. So the ones we used here were World English, Perspectives, 21st Century Communication and Reading, Keynote, and the Learn English with TED Talks app. I can share right now, actually, a link to get a demo code for 4 talks on the app, and there's no expiration date on the code, so definitely be sure to check that out. And if you're interested in learning more about National Geographic Learning programs with TED, I can also put this link in the chat box now too. And if you have any questions, I see Louisa put one in there about getting our books for her school in Italy. You can contact your local representative. I know Bia is our rep who covers Italy, and you can get her contact information from our website under the Contact a Sales Rep link. I'm just pulling it right up now, and I'll put it in here too. We'll be sending you some follow-up information in an email too. That will also include the link to the recording of this webinar, the certificate, as well as the slides from today. So great. And then this is just a quick slide about the app. All right, so I'm gonna, if anyone has any questions right now for Sean, we have a minute. We could answer 1 or 2. You want to put it in the chat box? And if not, that's fine. We can wrap up. All right. So it looks like no questions right now. If you do have one, you can always email us at ngl.webinars@cengage.com and we'll get back to you. But we invite you to connect more with us and join our community for teachers of English. We're so glad you could be here today. We do have several upcoming webinars. We have another one this week and then one next week too for teaching young learners of English. And then we'll start them back up in January. And definitely follow our InFocus blog. We feature helpful teaching tips from editors like Sean, from National Geographic Learning authors, consultants, as well as TED speakers and National Geographic explorers. So be sure to check that out and connect with us on our social channels. We'd love for you to be a part of the community. I see a question about the links to the other webinars. You can actually visit the site right up there, eltngl.com/webinars, and that will list our upcoming sessions, and you can register for them the same way you signed up for this one. So thanks all for being with us. It was a great turnout, and thanks for being so interactive. I'm going to send you all to a survey now so we can get some of your feedback. We'd love to hear what you thought.